demonstrating Darwinian adaptability. There's been a slight change with dessert that came in late, but still allowing us to almost respect our timing and land on our feet with just 15 minutes of delay. As you know, every time we organize RSMed, we invite one or several keynote speakers. At RSMed, we have constant analyses and experts coming, and we thought it would be interesting to invite people that, through their life experience, embodied an issue of geopolitics that we're interested in today. And right now, we have a keynote speaker who is a great speaker, who is a great expert, but also embodies a specific issue. So we have both in one person. And he will be talking about an issue that's been raised quite a bit since this morning, Europe. Europe is has been made fragile, and there's nothing new about it. It's not necessarily a pessimistic statement because it can bounce back. It has enough means to bounce back, but it is questioning its project, it's questioning its environment. And so we thought it would be great to have someone who can embody Europe as a keynote speaker. It turns out that in my short lifespan, I worked closely with Pierre Vimont and Pierre Vimont's staff. That was when he was chief of staff of Dominique de Villepin. Anyone who's worked in European diplomacy or defense or diplomacy generally knows about Pierre Vimont because he's a great French ambassador. He spent his entire career serving France, serving French diplomacy. And actually, you all know him, even if you're not really a diplomat or working in diplomacy, because you've all seen either the movie or the book Quai d'Orsay. And he's the character called Claude Maupas in the comic and in the movie Quai d'Orsay as well. I watched the movie again and I read the comic again, and I thought it was very realistic when it came to how it portrayed his cold-headedness. So I would like us to catch up on the time we've lost over lunch, and in a few words, what I want to say is that you have in front of you a great ambassador, an expert of international relations, an expert specifically of Europe. He started his career at the London Embassy in 1977. He was a chief of staff for the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Edith Cresson, Edith Guégou. He was also an ambassador and perm rep of France in Brussels between 1996 and 2002, and chief of staff of 3 French ministers for foreign affairs, Dominique de Villepin. That's when I met him, or at least I knew of him, Michel Barnier, and Philippe Douste-Blazy. He was ambassador of France in the United States. He was the Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service in Brussels to serve the EU. And until recently, because a great diplomat never stops, he was the special envoy for the confidence and security architecture with Russia of President Macron. In the movie, Claude Maupas, the character, when it's turmoil and there's war everywhere, he says, "Give me an hour." So, Mr. Ambassador, you have an hour, Your Excellency.
Merci, Amiral, de m'avoir invité à ces...
Thank you, Admiral, for inviting me to these strategic encounters. I am aware of the honor that it is, but also the difficult task that it is, because you gave me an hour. For any keynote speaker with a bit of experience, we know that that's the most dangerous hour, the one right after lunchtime. This is the crossing of the desert for any conference speaker. So to try and entertain you, I thought maybe I should make a lot of jokes during my speech. Maybe I'll show you I'll show you a movie or something like that, but what I'll do is that I'll do what the Admiral asked me to do instead of showing you a cartoon, is that based on my modest professional career, because I really keep thinking that I do not deserve the praises that are addressed at me, I will try and bring a few takeaways, key takeaways, to help us answer some of the questions that were raised this morning during the introductory session, which I found very interesting. And as always, when I come to these types of meetings, while listening to others, I completely change my speech and what I wanted to say. So I'd like to start off from what was said this morning. You said it yourself, we should try to understand and act upon the period, the time that we're going through at the moment. Something fascinates me about this point in time, which maybe makes this period of time very specific. Maybe you remember this sentence from Le Guépard, everything has to change in order for nothing to change. And those like me that are maybe blasé and have a 40-year-long career behind them tend to say it was better back in the day, we should go back to what was done back in the day. And after all this turmoil, everything will get back to what it was. However, I think we're actually going through a period where indeed everything is very different from what it used to be. And so people that are blasé and that find inspiration in the Leopard movie have to beware, because we are in a completely new chapter, and I think history cannot help us much. I admire very much historians, but I always keep in mind this sentence, I think from Paul Valéry, who said something like, history does not teach us anything because it contains everything at once, and thus we don't know how to find our bearings in it. I'd like also to quote another sentence that I like from the great historian Toynbee. He was asked, do you keep one main takeaway from history? And he had answered, no, I do not. And then he thought about it and he said, maybe just one. It's better not to try and invade Russia. And I think that's the key takeaway that we should keep in mind. That should be one of the main lessons of history. But the truth is that this period of time that we're going through is entirely new for the reasons that were already mentioned this morning. And maybe that explains why we struggle so much to put the finger exactly on what turmoils are happening at the moment. If we try and let's take the three main pillars of our history since 1945, so liberal democracy, prosperity, economic development, international relations based on a multilateral order founded on the 1945 agreements, and particularly based on the United Nations Charter. These three pillars, we've seen them, they've been shattered, they've been questioned, everything has changed since then. And we can hear, for example, the United Nations Secretary General saying that our problem right now is that we are faced with a multi-faceted world, meaning with several actors that are powerful enough to exert influence on the world order. And faced with this new multipolar reality, we haven't found the new rules of play. But maybe if we do define those new rules, we'll get some calm back and we'll find a path to peace. And then some people, and I subscribe to what they say it is quite complicated, And that's what Edgar Morin, for example, says, and he uses the concept of complexity. He says we are confronted with an never seen before complexity, a complexity in front of which we have no answers because we do not even manage yet to completely, fully appreciate this complexity. Throughout this morning, while discussing with everyone, I thought everywhere we see this complexity emerge, this complexity that we do not manage to completely measure yet, that we do not comprehend fully yet. This morning, a lot of the speakers rightly said that we were kind of in an in-between, in a very specific situation where, for example, in the art of war, in the defense industry, we have the emergence of new phenomenons, new technologies, new fields. Things are happening. AI is also being used more and more. So we are currently in an in-between. We are transitioning from old technologies to newer technologies. And I am struck by the way the war in Ukraine is evolving. Everyone has mentioned it. We can see some elements in that war of the 1914-1918 war. In some ways, it's just like the First World War. There's commandos in trenches, but on the other hand, Russia and Ukraine have reinvented a new war, have invented a new war of drones, because we went from the Turkish drones from 2 years ago that seemed extremely sophisticated 2 years ago to something that is completely different right now. And in this field, just as in many other fields, we are in sort of a gray zone and in between, where it is very difficult for the moment to bring a simple explanation, to offer a simple or even a complex explanation, and it's even more difficult to offer concrete actions, concrete paths to follow. And that is the reason why, when I talk to my former colleagues, either in Paris, in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, or in other ministries, or my former colleagues in Brussels, those working with the European Union institutions, I am struck by the fact that I'm talking with colleagues who tell me I do not know how to be an actor of the international scene anymore, of international relations. I can comment international relations in an instantaneous way, and I will come back to that in a second, but I am requested to give quick answers, rapid answers, and I can bring them. But if we're talking about building real strategy, real action in the long term, I do not know anymore how to do it, because I do not know where to start thinking about this problem. Jean Monnet, towards the end of his life, according to the testimony of a friend of Jean Monnet, would say to all these young European federalists that would come and see him and had all these brilliant ideas about building the Europe of defense, the Europe of new technologies, Jean Monnet would listen to them very politely, and at the end would say, young men, young girl, these ideas are excellent and I fully subscribe to them, but I would like to ask you a simple question. What will be your first step? What will be the first thing you will do to follow the path that you've described? If we take this question that was asked by Jean Monnet and you apply it to the Middle East, to the war in Ukraine, to any of the fields that were mentioned this morning and that related to the way we can, for example, manage the evolution of artificial intelligence, how to make sure we can master this new tool, we very often realize that we do not know what the first step is. And we do not know what the first step is because I think we do not yet fully comprehend what is currently happening. What I would like to invite you to do now, based on my modest experience and based on the experiment that I would like to also mention is that maybe the best way to move forward is not necessarily to try and conceptualize the problems that we are faced with at the moment, not necessarily to try and theorize the moments that we are going through, but maybe the best thing is to try and go the other way, start by the end and start with action. I am politician, so usually when I'm being asked how can we explain this war that's been started by Russia against Ukraine, is it about trying to push back time? Is it about trying to regain control of Ukraine and try and bring Ukraine back within the great Russian Empire? My answer is usually the following. We have no idea because it's happening in Putin's head and none of us knows what's going on in Putin's head. However, what we can do is being active. We can act. We can stop simply commenting international relations. Maybe we can ask ourselves, what should we do in order to stop this war? What should we do? What's the first step in order to stop this war?
Je me suis mis en tête de vous ennuyer encore.
So I had in mind to talk to you about this and suggest a few ideas to reflect on the necessity for the EU to change minds regarding the great European project that was launched a long time ago, and question ourselves on the methodology. I am thinking aloud, and I was invited to talk about and to reflect upon my life, and it came to my mind that I worked a lot for the European project, and that in the past it seemed quite obvious and natural because the things, for many reasons, things seemed easier. I am referring to the happy times of the 80s or 90s when we had Jacques Delors at the European Commission, President Mitterrand in Paris, Chancellor Kohl in Bonn and then later on Berlin. And whether you like her or not, Mrs. Thatcher in London, who was quite strong-minded but was a stable actor, and she had a strong vision, she had a clear strategy, and all those leaders had the quality of exercising their power for a long time, and they had the time to build a vision, to build a strategy that they had some time to implement. Jacques Delors had in mind to strengthen the interior European market. Chancellor Kohl wanted to support the project and was extraordinarily able to anticipate on future events. They were able to seize the chance of the fall of the Berlin Wall to create a geopolitical market. They set up the single currency, meaning the end of the Deutschmark, and they also built the German unity. They had a clear strategy and they were able to anticipate on the future and build a Europe of 12 state members, a very consistent group of countries with a rather similar level of economic development. And they had a heritage and a historical and geographical heritage that clearly affirmed their geographical footprint with a similar approach to geopolitics. At that time, Europe was growing, it was prosperous, new qualified majority rules were set up. The union was building up, and everything was there to allow the advent of this golden age. At the Maastricht time, after a long sprint, Europe had made it. It was the culminating point of the European project as we imagine it. And then gradually things started to change. Against this background, I then realized that things were becoming more complicated. Solidarity became less obvious, and other factors appeared as well. The situation can be interpreted in many different ways. In France, we have never been very favorable to enlargement. It started with Great Britain, and then it spread to Central and European countries. However, I disagree, and I think that the enlargement was one of the very rare geopolitical successes of the EU. What you really have to understand regarding this enlargement as envisaged by the then 10 members of the EU, and then later on 15 countries, they perhaps did not realize that we were taking on board some countries that were profoundly European, but as Milan Kundera said, had felt more often than not abandoned than their Western partners, especially through the Helsinki Agreements of 1975, that we Western Europeans still consider as an immense progress, but that these Central European countries felt meant rejection that they had to face from Western countries because they had that Soviet heritage, and they have not forgotten that those divergences in point of view. These feelings are very strong. Now, if I deny that enlargement is the root cause of our present difficulties, with time and with all the challenges that we face, and with and bearing in mind the 3 pillars that I mentioned earlier on, the rise of populism in Europe that threatens liberal democracy as we know it, the difficulty of the EU to ensure the economic growth that it used to have, its lack of competitivity with regards to its major rivals and competitors in the world, the US, China, and a number of Asian countries in the area of new technologies or others, and as was said this morning regarding geopolitical changes that give the feeling that Western countries are being marginalized. So we seem unable to take these challenges, but perhaps the reasons are others. Perhaps we have not been able to make the appropriate choices. First of all, a few words on our state of mind, and then I'll talk about our methodology. But first of all, state of mind in Brussels. The admirals used the word lies when he referred to Solzhenitsyn. And I think that there is some truth in what he says. In our Western societies, there is a kind of lie that spreads around and that we have to have the courage to shed the light on. Where I disagree from the Admiral is that on the side of Europe, to mention Solzhenitsyn, and even if I disagree with Viktor Orban that says that Brussels is the new Moscow, I still think that there is, you can find some of these lies in the present narrative that we hear from Brussels. It's not just that it's a lie, but these are truths to which people, by which people abide. It rather seems like a kind of bureaucratic language, which makes things more complicated because it's more difficult to overcome. Let me give you a couple of examples. Throughout my career, I heard that point of view day in, day out, according to which Brussels institutions are virtuous. They protect some principles, good principles, whereas those who don't abide by those principles are the bad ones. This is a very simplistic vision of the world, and it has led Europe into this world where powers are coming back to the forefront with direct and frontal disagreements in areas of Europe, in areas of Africa. This is a very caricatural vision, and it does not make much sense now. In diplomacy, both are tightly connected. You've got to protect the values whilst taking into account your own interests. European institutions have been very hypercritical with that respect, and I could name quote many examples. I will just give you one regarding our development policy with Africa, which did not lead to very convincing successes. So that policy was first and foremost serving the commercial interests of European countries. Hence the attacks on neo-colonialism. This is a reality that we have to take into account, and very often Brussels institutions failed to fully understand what this meant. The second idea that I would like to defend here is that beyond this reflection, these points of view on the fact that European institutions are defending good values, and you will hear that very often in France as well as elsewhere. And as we are entering difficult times in our history in France, there's the notion that the European construction has ignored the identity and the reality of the various state members, and it did not fully take into account the existence of European nations. Hence the disenchantment of European nations and the distance that grew between the European countries and the EU institutions, as institutions did no longer reflect national realities. Spending much of my career on hands in Brussels, I think that this is not the opinion that I get from my experience in Brussels. Even with a qualified majority, as we have it, the reality, as I experienced at every level, it's not true to say that we are taking reality into account. Let me tell you about one of the very first few experiences that I had in Brussels. We had Ministry of Agriculture from different member countries, and they represented a minority of states, and they said that they accepted that situation as a minority, but explained they would have some difficulties back in their countries, and asked Brussels to let them come back if they faced too many difficulties, and reopen the subject so as to reflect national difficulties in such cases. When the Minister of Agriculture went back to his country, his or her country, they were faced with stark oppositions on the streets, and they had to come back to Brussels, where they were totally ignored. This has always been part of the political game in Brussels, and we did not reflect this appropriately in political speeches. The truth is that if you have some problems, everyone is keen to listen to you in Brussels. Look at that example we talk about on the Mercosur project at present, and we've been working on this. I've heard about this for a long time in Brussels. We've reached an agreement which may not be ideal, and it keeps being improved. The sole objective of the Commission and its states members is to recognize that France still faces many difficulties, so we have to keep waiting and see if little by little the problem could be solved in France. And I sincerely think that as I have examined the agreement, I know that many clauses have been added to reflect French difficulties, but the real problem with France is of a political nature. As we all know, in France there is no trade project that can be adopted by the French Parliament, given the political situation and the systematic rejection of everything that is associated in people's mind to free trade. This is true in all sides for all political parties in France. And Brussels is taking this into account. They try to help us to the extent possible. So this is like a fable. It is a story to explain to you that this narrative that says that no one's point of view is taken into account in Brussels is wrong. We have to be aware of this. There's another event which is mentioned even by pro-Europeans in France. They tend to say that the real problem for the European nations is that they are facing a crazy bureaucracy from Brussels that makes regulations that are too numerous and sometimes contradictory, and we have to stop that race towards everlasting regulation process. You have perhaps had a chance to read the very thick report of Mario Draghi on European regulation and the necessary simplification. And this is all very true. But what people don't dare to say is that those who are responsible for that over-regulation are not the services of the Commission. It's the EU member states themselves, including France. Whenever there are some negotiations, we start working on a draft project, and countries like France want to add a number of amendments so as to be able to watch other state members and make sure there is as little competition as possible. I've always been surprised by Georges Clemenceau's sentence, dromedare is a horse drawn by someone in a parliamentary commission. If you want to do that little experience, take a text presented by the EU after a meeting of the college. It is a 2 or 3 pages long document, sometimes a little bit more if it's technical. Take that project at the beginning of the procedure, the legislative procedure in Brussels, and then look at it again after it's been through the parliament and the 27 members, and you will then see the difference, and you will understand the reality of legislative life in Brussels. I'm not questioning this. I think this is a normal process. As Mario Draghi, I could feel sorry that it goes too far and it's too picky, but this is a reality that we have to fully grasp. If we want to give more power back to state members, nothing prevents us from taking it. There are many areas in which state members take the lead, including on foreign policy, defense, security. And it is only in very precise areas related to the single market, monetary regulations, or industrial regulations, fisheries, agriculture. So in such cases, we need to have a qualified majority. So a complicated process. But I must say that interests and preoccupations of state members are fully reflected. Third element, and perhaps the most important one, the EU must change their state of mind. They've been repeating over the years that they want to become a geopolitical actor. Mrs. van der Leyen said it, and the former ex-representative to Foreign Affairs, Joseph Borrell, also mentioned Europe that should speak the language of power. And we keep hearing such opinions in the light of the new challenges that we face. But wanting to be a geopolitical actor has consequences. It means that Europe has to rethink itself and consider itself as a power. And this implies many things. And as you realize, Europe is not in a position to do this as of today. And I would like all of us to be aware of this. Europe was not designed to that purpose. It is a multilateral group of 27 state members, and you cannot expect the EU to act as if it was a single entity with the agility and the efficiency of a single body. Decisions have to be made by 27 state members, and in such a situation, it's difficult to have this, to speak with one voice on history, geopolitics, economy. it's not the same situation that we faced when there were 12 or 15 of us. So let's be aware of that reality. When we try to engage a discussion with 27 members on Russia, and in the past, on the first Ukraine war that led to the annexion of Donbass and the Russian presence in Donbass, at that time we had not been able, since 2005, we hadn't been able to have a clear strategy against Russia because we had divergent points of view. This is the reality of European geopolitics. We have to face it. On that basis, we have to move forward. Europe is this very specific animal, and it has to reinvent itself if it wants to play a real role on the international scenes and find the appropriate position, perhaps not like the US, but being a relevant actor and being able to act and be up to the challenges that it faces. However, the state of mind of Europe is not designed for this. Over the years, Europe has considered itself as an actor of peace, built on soft power, as Joseph Now said when he was still amongst us. It was built on the notion that we could, through development, create prosperity in our neighboring countries and bring peace. Now, Europe has to adapt itself to the new reality, but you can see that it is a transformation of spirits that's necessary. Europe has to rethink the way it thinks and the way it acts, and that's very complicated. What fascinates me is that very often the problems you find in Brussels are the same that you find in European capitals. It's difficult for us now to learn the diplomacy lessons from the past. We have to think of what must be the first step, but we must also adopt a long-term strategy. We must be able to think in the short term as well as in the long term. When there is 27 of us, it's very difficult to do so, and European countries are sometimes quite hostile to that approach. And this is something that we have to think about and reflect on. I will give you a few concrete examples because I think examples are very interesting. Let's take Ukraine. In spite of all what was said, President Trump is not reaching a result and cannot get a ceasefire or any progress regarding Ukraine. And we see a gap that could leave some room for the Europeans. They could be the ones that take hold of this matter and try and advance a ceasefire or some kind of solution, and reflect upon what could be a real peace settlement, enabling Russia and Ukraine to have strategic stability. And as a third step, we should think beyond a peace settlement and think of a new security architecture in the EU, taking into account the Helsinki agreements and inventing an entire new solution reflecting the complexity of European security.
Semble-t-il.
But I think that the issue right now is that this 2 or 3 step thinking process hasn't started in Brussels because there is no agreement between the 27 member states, but also because this way of thinking about the challenges we're confronted with is so new that there's a bit of apprehension and even fear, I would say, of taking up this enormous challenge. Second difficulty, and it's quite obvious, we've seen it. If it's difficult to move forward when there's 27 of us, we have to invent, in a smart way, new formats, more flexible formats, not so much without taking into account our differences, but while taking account our differences, but making sure that in this very fast-changing world, if Europe wants to be a political actor, Europe also has to be able to move fast. That's been started with something that's really interesting called the Coalition of Volunteers. You've seen it. It started, it was based on French and UK initiatives and then embarked new partners alongside it. We did something similar in 2003 when we started up conversations with Iran on its nuclear program. Fundamentally, as you know, this initiative started by 3 member states, the UK, Germany and France, gained ground because after a lot of difficulties, Iranians decided to play along, and it became a European affair because on top of these 3 states, we put the Javier Solana, the representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs, and it was a success because the member states agreed that these 3 states would pilot this initiative. And the remaining 3 members of the Security Council also agreed that the presidency would be ensured by the European Union, by Javier Solana back then. And that's quite a rare example of a European diplomacy, successful European diplomacy. Why not try and do this again in the Middle East, in the context of some conflicts in Africa as well and elsewhere? It is not impossible to do. All we need is some political will. I think this is crucial. Third element on which I want to insist, because it seems to me that Europe has failed many times on this. In this increasingly complex world, there are 3 gigantic players, the US, China, and Russia. 3 giants that try and redefine a world order based upon the 19th century practices and on power play. If we keep trying to defend a world order that's based upon principles that we've adopted post-1945, we won't succeed if we act alone. We have to find partners. And there again, Europe has lost some of its diplomatic skills. We've seen it in the Ukrainian crisis. We were obsessed with this conflict happening near its borders, and that is completely understandable. But Europe seemed to be aggressive to other European countries, countries in Africa and in Asia, because they did not understand how essential this conflict was for global security. And it seemed to Europe that other conflicts that took place on other continents were less important. And when you behave like this, when you behave like the Europeans did, the result is immediate. You saw that in what we call the global south. I don't like this expression, but it does correspond to a certain reality. So in the countries of the global south, we started hearing criticisms about Europeans' arrogance, about neocolonialism, and about the inability of Europeans to understand other countries' problems. And there again, we need to have a mindset change. Europeans need to adapt, and they need to adapt intelligently. When I listened to our conversation this morning, I was very struck about what was said regarding the situation in the Middle East. I think in the next few days and next few weeks, we'll realize and see a country like Turkey that was starting up negotiations again on Gaza and on the situation in Palestine, and on what will need to be talked about soon, the security of the entire region. So whether you like it or not, and maybe some of you will be hurt by what I'm about to say, faced with the policies and strategy followed by Israel since the 7th of October, we see that the behavior of Arab countries, including the Gulf countries, is evolving, is differentiating from Iran. They have a profound distrust for Iran, but they've also realized that the nation that became revisionist in the Middle East, disruptive, is not Iran anymore, but Israel. So without talking about a new alliance with Iran, I would say that Saudi Arabia's attitude and Qatar's attitude and the Emirates' attitude as well towards Iran is changing. European countries must understand what's going on, must understand these evolutions, and must be able to quickly adapt to these new realities. And I will go even further. Let's take several of the global south countries that are part of BRICS, like India, Brazil, South Africa. These three countries are not being complacent towards China and Russia, the two main powers in the BRICS group. They are observing them with suspicion. They are distrustful of them. Some of them start even taking some distance. So that's how, if the EU manages to be agile, flexible, proactive, maybe there the EU could create links, bonds, relations, and it needs to do it quickly. So these are a few examples of what I think represents a mindset transformation taking place, and that should be taking place within the European Union member states, and also, I insist upon it, within the European Union institutions. At the moment, and I can imagine several of you are following it closely, the European Commission is being criticized for being too busy with defense issues, because it is putting money on the table and is offering to help European industries to try and help member states to reinforce their defense capabilities. And sometimes a few comments have been made by European leaders on this. A few awkward comments have been made, but we should simply look back at the European Union Treaty and look at what was planned. We shouldn't complain, but simply recall what the rules are. If we have the political will to do it, we can use all the instruments, all the rules that were set in Brussels to move forward. A few words now on the method that should be employed, and please forgive me, I've probably been speaking for too long. But since you made the mistake of giving me the floor, I seized the opportunity, and I would like to share a few words on the method to use. Aside from the European Union, aside from Europe, I think we should return to the rules of diplomacy that we seem to have forgotten about in Brussels, but unfortunately not just in Brussels as well. First idea, it is quite simple. Unfortunately, this is something I have to repeat often. Initially, diplomacy fundamentally is a work of listening. It's work based on listening, respecting, and dialogue. Admiral, I think you quoted Plato, and you talked about being well-meaning. And I would say, even with our worst enemies, that is precisely what diplomacy is about. It's about caring and benevolence. We should be brave enough to talk with everyone, even if we are in disagreement, even if we are in conflict. We should discuss with everyone, because we have a tendency to underestimate our interlocutors. I could quote a lot of examples, but let me give you two examples. Immigration. The topic of immigration for 10 years now has become a topic that is loaded with emotions in our countries, and we see some political parties benefiting of the emotional load of this topic. At a time, I was given the task to prepare a summit between the EU and Africa on migration. That summit took place, but in order to call for this summit, and in order to agree on a very diplomatic text that tried and work around the differences, I was requested to work for about a year with various actors. And what really struck me in this dialogue that I was trying to organize between Africa and Europe was that each of the parties had a dialogue, a narrative that didn't fit with the others. And the idea is quite simple. The Africans are the ones feeling 90% of migration movements on their continent, but they think fundamentally that in the end migration can be a positive thing for the development of their countries. And they're faced with Europeans that would tell them, for us it's a disaster and we absolutely need to stop sending people to Europe. In order to reconcile these two narratives, what I had to do, what we set ourselves as a goal, was to show how these two parties could create systems, training, control, border control systems in order to stop these massive influxes that cause so many issues in the eyes of Europeans. But the truth is that everyone saw that there was a way to move forward in a wise way. There were quite simple ways of agreeing, but it was absolutely impossible because the Europeans were so vexed and emotional that they did not listen. And in their speeches, in their narratives, and I was quite struck by this, they would go to the Africans and tell them, it's very simple, either you do what we tell you to do, or we do not give any more development aid. So try and put yourself in the shoes of our African interlocutors. It's very difficult to accept this type of narrative. That summit took place in 10 years ago, and we see that we are still in the exact same situation. So diplomacy starts with listening and trying to establish dialogue. That has to be done even if we are faced with interlocutors like I'm thinking of Russia in the case of Ukraine, even if we're faced with an interlocutor that it is extremely difficult to work with, either because they practice lies, like Admiral Vassar mentioned, or maybe because they actually believe in their own lies, unfortunately for many of them. So we have to find a form of agreement, and that is quite difficult. And yet I remain convinced that the necessity of dialogue must remain a golden rule of diplomacy. Otherwise, and we've seen it in Ukraine, otherwise the only channels of communication that were maintained between a certain number of great European powers and Russia were intelligence services. I am not saying this is not useful. These exchanges, these communications are useful, but they are not enough if we want to solve issues in the long term. So listening and establishing a dialogue are necessary. Secondly, I think we have to accept the nature of compromise. That is something that strikes me increasingly. I have spent quite a lot of time in Brussels to find agreements and compromises with our partners. We always knew that a compromise means you do not get everything you wanted, but you can get a part of what you wanted, and the important thing is to get respect, protection, and the fact that our most important interests are taken into account. Right now, we are in a form of hysteria in Brussels and in some European capitals as well. I'm not going to name them, but you probably already know them. Compromise is not accepted anymore as the natural result of a negotiation. It's either everything or nothing, and if we don't have everything, we'd rather go home. I am quite perplexed by this evolution. I think that if we become unable to come back to this fundamental, basic rule, meaning everyone has to make a step towards the other, and the most important thing is to know who should make this first step. That's the hardest bit. So if there are no steps being taken on either side, it's very unlikely that we'll get any results. Third idea, and I'll remain brief, we have to be able to walk on our 2 feet. Everyone talks a lot about the slogan that was repeated again by Trump and his team, peace through strength or firmness. Historians will remind you that it was actually Ronald Reagan that said this for the first time 50 years ago. And I think this is quite another fundamental principle of diplomacy. You can move forward if you display firmness in front of your opponent, and that is how you reach peace or a compromise or your goal generally. So walking on your 2 feet is essential. Another idea, I've mentioned it earlier and I will not insist upon it too much, but I think that in Brussels that's still one of the problems that we encounter. I'm talking about the ability to reconcile short-term and long-term goals in parallel. In the countries that are close to the border with Russia, when I speak with interlocutors there and I ask them to think of what could be the future of security in Europe, because I think it's important to try and find a common agreement on what our long-term perspective is, and it can actually help us in almost a retro-engineering way to find and better understand the most essential items in the short-term negotiation to reach a ceasefire. So reconciling long-term goals and short-term goals has been discredited. I have to admit to it openly every time I try and encourage my interlocutors to think long-term. They tell me there is no point in trying to move forward and think about the long-term. Some of them tell me we do not even want to think of long-term security in Europe because it will never be conceivable as long as Russia exists in its current form. It feels to me as if we should be worried about this. And my last point is about the method, and that is an issue that is becoming increasingly pertinent. And I'll take as an example what's going on with the peace plan by Trump for Gaza. We have to understand comprehensively the situation as it is, and we also have, as Jean Monnet was saying, to move forward step by step in an incremental way, in a progressive way. If we step back for a second, and that is an interesting thing to do because it helps us better understand the rationale that's quite complex of President Trump, his peace plan in 20 points for peace between Israel and Palestinians is kind of a hidden way, a disguised way for Trump to get what he wants, which is no more strikes and bombs on Gaza, hostages being freed, and solving the issue of Hamas's presence in Gaza, demilitarization, disarmament, non-participation in the future government that could govern Gaza. That is where his interest lies, that's where he focuses, and if he manages to get it before Friday and before the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded, he thinks that it's for sure that he cannot be deprived from this Nobel Peace Prize. But the truth is that the next step, the next two steps, so the future of the Palestinian state, the promotion of its political rights, the existence of a Palestinian state, and the emergence of a government in Gaza, that's not something that he's interested in at all. And maybe that is a formidable opportunity for European diplomacy. In consultation with its Arab partners, they could take things back and try and move forward on these fronts. I think we should pay more attention to President Trump and maybe criticize him less. In his three-part plan, he intelligently highlighted the first part, and he showed, as I think is essential, that he is able to move forward step by step and to do things progressively, incrementally. What he suggests for Gaza is also what we should be doing for Ukraine. I admit it is difficult, but we've seen at the summit in Anchorage in Alaska that President Trump completely gave up on the idea of a ceasefire that initially seemed to be the first step to move forward. I think it's up to the Europeans and to the Middle East to try and defend their ideas, to try and show through concrete examples like this one what they can do, and to come back to what I call the fundamental rules of diplomacy, that they are a credible geopolitical actor, efficient, proactive, flexible actor, which unfortunately European diplomats are not anymore. So I hope I've given you enough reasons for hoping and being optimistic so that you don't exit this conference room completely disappointed and pessimistic. Thank you very much for your attention.